The Galactic Coalition had a very strict, very official, very thoroughly documented policy about humanity. Ignore them. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were powerful, not because they had done something so spectacularly stupid that the entire council needed to look away in collective embarrassment, though, admittedly, that had also happened. No, the policy existed because humanity was, in the words of Senior Ambassador Vorak of the Thelian Reach, statistically irrelevant. He had said this at the 44th Coalition Assembly, in front of 400 delegates, with full confidence and absolutely zero awareness of what was coming for him personally. That moment would later be carved into the wall of the Coalition's Hall of Regrettable Statements, right next to the Duvari Admiral, who once declared that artificial gravity was a temporary novelty. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. My name is Brix, Sub-Coordinator Brix Talleen, of the Monitoring Division, Sector 9. My job officially was to track civilizations of low strategic value and file quarterly reports that nobody read. My job unofficially was to sit in a small room, drink something warm and slightly fermented, and watch species do absolutely nothing of consequence. I was very good at my job. For 6 standard years I monitored humanity, 6 years of watching them argue with each other on their data networks, 6 years of watching their ground-based vehicles get stuck in long honking lines that seemed to serve no purpose except to test the psychological endurance of their drivers, 6 years of watching them eat food that by any reasonable chemical analysis should have caused immediate organ failure, and then post images of it for others to admire. I filed my reports. Nobody read them. Then, on the morning of the 7th year, I received an emergency alert from the Senior Monitoring Council. It said, "Please explain what is happening in Sector 9. I looked at my screens. I blinked. I looked again. Then I did something I had not done in 6 years of professional monitoring. I spilled my drink. It had started, as most things with humans apparently did, with someone being underestimated. 42 days prior, a Duvari patrol fleet had decided that a human cargo lane was an excellent location for what the Duvari military called routine sovereignty demonstrations. This was a polite way of saying they flew their warships through human territory, made threatening sounds on open channels, and waited for the smaller species to politely move aside. It had worked on the Polari, it had worked on the Solvan Collective, it had worked on 17 other species who had the good sense to look at a Duvari cruiser and feel something reasonable, like fear. The human cargo captain, a woman by the name of Olta Vresh, did not move aside. According to the flight recorder, she actually increased speed. The Duvari commander, Flux Commander Daro Ven, sent a formal warning. Standard procedure, clear language, unmistakable in its intent. Captain Vresh responded, and I will quote this directly because I have replayed the audio 117 times and it still makes my secondary neural cluster do something I can only describe as laughter. "Son, I am delivering medical supplies to 4,000 people on Relay Station Mirek. You are in my lane. Either move or become a very expensive speed bump. Your choice. You have 30 seconds. Daro Vane had never been spoken to like that in his life. He moved, not because he was afraid of one cargo ship. A Duvari cruiser against a cargo hauler was not a contest. It was an insult to the word contest. He moved because, in the 30 seconds that Captain Vresh had given him, his long-range sensors had detected something that his tactical officer initially refused to report, because the numbers seemed like a calibration error. 14 human military vessels had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel, positioned at every exit vector of that corridor, silent, running no active weapons signatures, just there, watching, waiting. They had not announced themselves. They had not made threats. They had simply arrived, the way you might find someone already sitting in a dark room when you walked in, and realized they had been there the entire time. Daro Van moved his cruiser. Captain Olta Vresh delivered her medical supplies, and I, Sub-Coordinator Brix Talleen, 6 years into the most boring monitoring assignment in Coalition history, started writing the most frantic report of my career. They planned this, I told my supervisor, Coordinator Pellas Wynn, who had the look of someone who very much wished they had called in sick that morning. "That is a significant claim," she said. "The fleet was already positioned," I said, "before the Duvari entered the corridor. The humans knew the patrol route. They knew the timing. They let the Duvari commander make his move, gave him exactly one witness, and then revealed the rest of their hand only after he had committed." Pellas stared at my report. She turned it sideways, as though the angle might make it less alarming. "Brix," she said slowly, How long has this been going on? That, I said, is exactly the question I have been asking myself for the last 4 hours. We went back through the records together, not just the last 42 days, all 6 years of my monitoring data, all the reports nobody had read, all the moments I had logged as routine or culturally insignificant, or on one memorable occasion. Please do not make me explain this. It involves a competitive cooking event and a minor diplomatic incident, and somehow those two things are connected. What we found looking at it all together rather than as individual unrelated data points was deeply, profoundly unsettling. The humans had been mapping coalition patrol routes for at least 4 years. They had been cataloguing the response times of every military force within 6 sectors. They had established resupply relationships with 11 non-coalition species, quietly, through trade agreements that looked, individually, like nothing. Together they formed a logistical network that could sustain a prolonged military operation without touching a single coalition supply line. They had done all of this while the coalition's official policy was to ignore them, while Senior Ambassador Vorak was calling them statistically irrelevant. While I was filing reports nobody read. Pella set down the file. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window of our monitoring station, the stars did their usual thing, which was to exist without any concern for the political crisis currently developing in the room behind them. Brix, she said finally. Yes, Coordinator. When was the last time a coalition monitoring report on humanity was reviewed by the Strategic Council? I checked the records. It has not been reviewed, I said. Not once. In 19 standard years. She closed her eyes. Get me a direct channel to the council chamber. They are currently in session for the Duvari territorial expansion hearing. Yes, said Pellas Wynn, who had in the last 2 hours aged approximately a decade. I imagine that hearing is about to become considerably more complicated. The Strategic Council of the Galactic Coalition had been meeting for 3 hours when we interrupted them. They were not happy about the interruption. They became significantly less happy when they saw what we had to show them. Grand Coordinator, Shavala Orr, the eldest and most decorated member of the council, looked at the intelligence map I had assembled. She looked at the trade network. She looked at the fleet positioning data from the Sector 9 corridor. She looked at it all for a long time, the way someone looks at a fire they do not yet understand the size of. Then she asked the question that every person in that room was thinking and not saying. How long, said Grand Coordinator Shavala Orr, very quietly, have the humans known that we were not watching them? I thought about Captain Olta Vresh, delivering medical supplies with 14 warships positioned silently at every exit vector. I thought about 4 years of mapping, 19 years of ignored reports. I thought about a species that the entire coalition had collectively decided was not worth paying attention to. I thought about how, if you wanted to build something without anyone noticing, the best possible thing in the galaxy that could happen to you was for everyone in the galaxy to agree, officially, in writing, that you were not interesting enough to watch. I believe, I said carefully, that they have known for quite some time. The room was very, very quiet. Outside, the stars continued not caring, and somewhere in Sector 9 I was almost certain Captain Olta Vresh was already on her next delivery run. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when very intelligent people realize, all at once, that they have made a very stupid mistake. It is not a comfortable silence. It is the silence of Grand Coordinator Shavala Orr staring at an intelligence map and doing the mental arithmetic of 19 wasted years. It is the silence of 12 council members who had, at various points in their careers, personally voted to reduce humanity's monitoring priority. It is the silence of a room full of the most powerful decision-makers in the known galaxy, collectively understanding that they had been outwitted, quietly, patiently, without a single shot fired. And it was, if I am being completely honest, the most entertaining silence I had ever sat inside. I say that with full awareness that my career was probably also sitting in that silence, slowly turning a very unfortunate color. Grand Coordinator Orr spoke first, because that was what Grand Coordinators did. They spoke first. They set the tone. They projected calm authority, even when the intelligence report in front of them suggested that calm authority was perhaps not the most proportionate response to the current situation. Contact our diplomatic attaché on the human station, she said. I want a formal meeting requested. Quiet channels. Nothing through the standard coalition broadcast. The aide beside her hesitated. The humans have not formally requested anything, Coordinator. There is no incident on record. Legally, the Sector 9 situation was resolved without conflict. Yes, said Orr. That is precisely what concerns me. She was right to be concerned. Because a species that creates a situation, resolves it without a single weapon discharge, leaves no formal complaint, and disappears back into the background, that species is not reacting. That species is demonstrating. There is a difference, and the difference is important, and the Coalition had just been given a demonstration so clean and so controlled that it could have been a textbook entry. I pulled up the Human Diplomatic Registry on my secondary screen. It was like most things about humanity in our official records, embarrassingly thin. Name of representative, Gorvan Sule. Title, Attaché for External Relations, Sector 9 Office. Years of service, 11. Previous postings, listed as various, which in diplomatic language meant either classified or we did not think to ask. I flagged the name to Pellis. She looked at it. She sent me a look that said, very clearly, Brix, I have a very bad feeling about this man. I sent her a look back that said equally clearly, Coordinator, so do I. Gorvan Sule arrived at the Coalition chamber the following morning, which meant he had either been nearby already or he had traveled at a speed that would have required a pre-positioned ship. Neither option was reassuring. He was, physically, unremarkable by human standards. Medium height, light brown skin, hair that had gone grey at the sides in a way that humans apparently found distinguished rather than alarming. He wore the standard attire of a Coalition diplomatic attaché, pressed and correct, with the small blue pin of the Human Outer Sector Office on his collar. He carried no documents. He brought no aids. He sat down across from Grand Coordinator Orr, folded his hands on the table, and smiled the way a person smiles when they have already read the ending of the story and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Grand Coordinator, he said, it is a genuine honor. I have wanted to visit this chamber for some time. Attaché Sule, said Orr, in the careful tone of someone speaking to a fire they still did not fully understand. Thank you for coming on short notice. Of course, said Sule, though I will admit, the notice was not entirely short. We have been anticipating this conversation for approximately 3 years. The room temperature dropped by several emotional degrees. Orr did not blink. I respected that about her enormously. Then perhaps, she said, we should stop pretending otherwise and speak plainly. Sule's smile widened, just slightly. I would like nothing more. What followed was 2 hours of the most extraordinary diplomatic exchange I had ever monitored, and I had monitored the Polari border negotiations of 2291, during which 2 ambassadors had simultaneously accused each other of being fictional. Sule did not threaten, he did not posture, he did not make demands in the loud chest-forward way of the Duvari or the elaborate legally suffocating way of the Thelian Reach. He simply talked, pleasantly and at a conversational pace, and every third sentence casually revealed something that confirmed, in yet another way, exactly how thoroughly humanity had been paying attention while everyone else was not paying attention to them. The trade network was real. 11 independent species, none of them coalition members, all of them quietly aligned with human resupply infrastructure. The network had been operational for 7 years. The patrol mapping was real. The coalition's standard military rotations across sectors 7 through 12 had been documented, analyzed, and cross-referenced against historical response times going back 2 decades. Sule mentioned this, the way you might mention that you had learned the bus schedule. And the fleet. The 14 ships in Sector 9 had not been a reaction. They had been one part of a 3-sector repositioning that humanity had been rotating through, on a careful schedule, for 2 years. Nobody had noticed because each individual movement had looked routine, because nobody had been watching, because the reports were not being read, because the policy was ignore them. We are not here to cause disruption, Sule said, when he had finished laying all of this on the table with the patient. Methodical calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and was finding the reality of it quite satisfying. Humanity has no interest in conflict with the coalition. We never have. We are, as your records correctly note, a relatively small species with limited territorial reach. And yet, said Orr. And yet, agreed Sule, pleasantly, we are also a species that reads documentation very carefully, including, for instance, the Coalition's own Charter on Member Species Security Guarantees, which we note applies only to registered Coalition partners. A pause. The kind of pause that has weight. We would, said Sule, very much like to discuss partnership terms. I replayed that sentence 6 times after the meeting concluded. We would very much like to discuss partnership terms, said at the end of 2 hours of quiet, methodical proof that humanity had spent nearly 2 decades making itself indispensable to 11 independent species, invisible to the Coalition's monitoring apparatus, and strategically positioned at every corridor that mattered in 3 sectors. Said at the end of a demonstration that began with a cargo captain who refused to move and ended with the Coalition's Grand Coordinator sitting across from a man with grey at his temples and no documents, realizing that the partnership terms had, functionally, already been decided. Pellas found me in the monitoring room afterward, still staring at my screens. She set 2 cups of something warm and slightly fermented on the desk and sat down beside me. He knew, I said. From the moment he walked in, he knew exactly what we had found, what we did not know yet, and precisely how much of the conversation was him telling us things versus us discovering things he had already prepared for us to discover. Yes, said Pellas. He carried no documents because he did not need documents. Everything he was going to say was already in our own files, in the reports nobody read, in the data we had collected and never reviewed. Yes, said Pellas again. We handed them the intelligence. We did the monitoring. We gathered the data. We just never bothered to look at it. Pellas picked up her cup. She took a long, slow sip of the fermented something. Brix, she said, with the exhausted dignity of someone who had reached the absolute end of a very long day and had decided to simply sit in it. Do you know what the Coalition's approved response was? 19 years ago, when humanity first applied for observer status. I looked at her. No, it was filed, she said, under low priority review. Pending further assessment of species strategic value. She set her cup down. The application is still open. It was never formally denied. I stared at her. Gorvan Sule mentioned this at the end of the meeting, she continued, after the Grand Coordinator had already agreed in principle to partnership discussions. He mentioned it the way you mention a small detail you nearly forgot. He mentioned it with that smile, and then he thanked everyone for their time and left. Outside the window, Sector 9 continued its quiet existence. Somewhere out there, cargo ships moved through corridors that 14 warships had quietly secured 2 years ago. Somewhere out there, 11 independent species were connected by a supply network they had each agreed to individually, without knowing the full shape of what they were joining. Somewhere out there, a woman named Olta Vresh was probably already on another delivery run, moving through a lane that was hers because she had simply refused on a specific day to move aside. And somewhere considerably closer, in a Coalition chamber that had just had a very long morning, Grand Coordinator Shavala Orr was looking at a 19-year-old observer application and understanding, with complete clarity, that it had never needed to be approved. It had simply needed to be left open, by a species nobody had been paying attention to, who had been paying attention to everything. My report to the Strategic Council, submitted that evening, was the first monitoring document on humanity to receive a Priority 1 classification in the history of the Coalition's Sector 9 office. I also noted, at the bottom, in the section reserved for analyst recommendations, one final observation. We had been monitoring humanity for 19 years. We had gathered thousands of hours of data. We had recorded conversations, tracked vessels, catalogued trade agreements, and documented behavioral patterns across an entire civilization. And we had, at no point in those 19 years, ever once considered the possibility that they were watching us back. I recommended, in the strongest professional language available to a sub-coordinator of the monitoring division, that someone start reading the reports. I also recommended, with slightly less professional language but equal sincerity, that whoever redesigned humanity's monitoring priority do so before the next quarterly filing cycle, because I had a feeling deep in the part of my neural cluster that had started doing the laughter thing more frequently since yesterday morning, that there were more reports coming, a lot more, from the species nobody had paid attention to, who had, very quietly, been paying attention to everything.